Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's event, the Brussels Effect, Digital Markets Regulation in East Asia. My name is Lilla Norakish, and I'm a Senior Policy Analyst for the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. Thank you for joining us today. Following the European Union's groundbreaking Digital Markets Act, a wave of regulatory activity is sweeping across the globe. This phenomenon, known as the Brussels effect, is prompting various jurisdictions to craft their own approaches to governing digital platforms. Today's discussion focuses specifically on East Asia, a region with unique market dynamics. Our esteemed panelists will offer valuable insights into the evolving landscape of digital markets regulation in this critical part of the world. This timely conversation will delve into the potential implications of these regulations for innovation, competition, economic growth, and national security within East Asia and beyond. Before we begin, let me briefly introduce our speakers, which include leading antitrust experts from Taiwan, Japan, Korea, and the United States. Dr. Andy Chen serves as the Vice Chairperson of the Taiwan Fair Trade Commission. Previously, Dr. Chen served as a commissioner of the Taiwan Fair Trade Commission from 2007 to 2010. Dr. Chen was a professor of law at the School of Law of Changyuan Christian University in Taiwan from 2010 to 2021, and Dean of the Law School from 2019 to 2021. Before his commission, he held various leadership positions at Changyuan Christian University, including law professor, dean of the law school, and chair of the financial and economic department. Dr. Chen has published extensively on antitrust and regulatory issues with a focus on the economic analysis of law. Thank you, Vice Chairperson Chen, for joining us today. Mr. Shigeru Kitamura is the president and the CEO of Kitamura Economic Security Incorporated, a consulting firm focused on economic protection and security issues. Mr. Kitamura has had a highly distinguished career in public services, including serving as the National Security Advisor for the Government of Japan between 2019 and 2021, and as the Director of Cabinet Intelligence from 2011 to 2019. Mr. Kitamura has served several honors, including Order of Brilliant Star with Grand Cordon from the Taiwanese government for his contribution to Japan-Taiwan relations, and the U.S. Department of Defense Medal for Distinguished Public Service for his role in strengthening the Japan-United States alliance in 2020. Mr. Kitamura is also the author of 3 books on national and economic security. We are honored to have you joining us, Mr. Kitamura. Dr. Richard Shin is the senior advisor at Bae, Kim & Lee, a leading law firm based in Korea with offices throughout Asia. In addition to working at a number of leading economic consulting firms, Dr. Shin has also worked at the U.S. Department of Justice Antitrust Division's Economic Analysis Group, as well as at the Bureau of Economics at the U.S. FTC. Dr. Shin is the top expert on antitrust economics and law, and he has submitted numerous reports and testified before the Korean Fair Trade Commission on various competition issues with a focus on innovation-intensive industries and intellectual property. Mr. Joseph Van Coniglio is the Director of Antitrust and Innovation Policy at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, leading the Schumpeter project on competition policy. Mr. Coniglio has written and published widely on all aspects of antitrust and innovation policy with a focus on tech platforms, dynamic competition, and digital regulation. He has been quoted in leading publications like the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and the Reuters. Prior to ITIF, Mr. Coniglio worked as an associate at the law firms Sidley Austin and Wilson Sonsini Goodrich and Rosati, where he specialized in civil non-merger investigations and counseling for large technology and financial services companies. Mr. Coniglio worked at both the US FTC and FCC, as well as at the US Department of Justice Antitrust Division. Before we delve into the conversation, I would like to encourage our online viewers to actively participate by submitting questions via Slido for the Q&A session. Now, let's begin. Dr. Chen, I would like to ask you to deliver your remarks.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Lila, and thank you for the ITIF for inviting me in this very interesting and important webinar. I think as Lila has pointed out in this introduction, the Brussels effect is making waves in antitrust enforcement globally, and Taiwan is no exception. And inspired by the draft and the enactment of the Digital Market Act, DMA, the Taiwan Fair Trade Commission had taken steps to communicate its position towards digital markets and competition to the public. And we also elaborated on the necessity of the DMA style regulation in Taiwan. And in December 2022, the TFTC released the white paper on competition policy in digital markets. And although the white paper is a new initiative by the TFTC, it isn't entirely out of the left field. It was a synthesis of theoretical advancements and a revised summary of the TFTC past enforcement experiences in digital cases. And those past enforcement experiences contain several cases overlap with those addressed by other jurisdictions. However, even though the facts and the issue are similar, but the TFTC has had in some cases arrived at a different conclusion from other jurisdictions. I think a notable example is the Android app pre-installation case. The case has been handled by both EU and Korea, and I think in both jurisdictions, the Android system has been found to be violative of the Competition Act. But in Taiwan, we reached a conclusion of non-violation of our competition law based partially on the market surveys we conducted for the case. And in the survey, we had found that the market shares for iOS and the Android systems, operating systems in Taiwan were nearly equal. And that means that even though both systems command a near 50% market share, but we could still perceive the competition for the market was there. And secondly, we also found that the user in Taiwan did not exhibit a strong status quo bias, where they exclusively use apps developed for their specific systems. I think the status quo bias had been a very important reasoning foundation for both the EU and the Korea to find a violation of this case. And also we have conducted a survey of the app developers in Taiwan. And the survey also revealed that the pre-installation shortened the time of app development and facilitated system integration and ultimately promoting innovation. So the case is kind of exemplifying one of the approaches the TFTC outlined in the white paper, connecting theoretical concepts to empirical studies. So the white paper explored 14 competitive issues relating to digital markets, including self-preferencing issues and killer acquisition, algorithm and collusion, and so on. And for each category, we summarize the enforcement experiences we had and identify the problems confronting us and propose solution to the challenges. Even though there are many details in the white paper, I just want to, in the interest of time, I just want to summarize some of the overarching enforcement principles that we recommended in the white paper. The first one is that we recommended that local nexus needs to be considered when transplanting other jurisdictions' experience or legislations. And secondly, international cooperation remains crucial. And staying informed of the recent developments of theories and cases allow the TFTC to sort of preparing a checklist to examine whether domestically we had similar problems and whether domestic regulatory framework are adequate in addressing those problems. And thirdly, the white paper suggests that the TFTC commit its enforcement resources to establishing market contestability within the digital market. So we are not looking only what is happening or what will be happening in the future within the digital market. And probably we will look backward to the very beginning, whether the competition among or between different systems are vibrant. And so that is kind of the competition that we will pay attention to. And finally, given the highly complicated and dynamic nature of digital competition, currently the TFTC is following a case-centered and issue-driven approach. And we will use a rule of reason reviewing standard encompassing both the anti-competitive as well as the pro-competitive effects from arrangement or conducts undertaken in digital market. I think that at this moment, it may be more desirable than ex-ante regulation in Taiwan. So based on the completion of our white paper, currently the TFTC is implementing the recommendation prescribed in the white paper. So for example, we just finished revising our guideline on market definition. And in the revision, we incorporated the idea of network effect and two-sided market into the reviewing standard and allowing the TFTC to take into account the factors that are related to digital market into consideration when reviewing cases in digital market. And we will update and revise, if necessary, the white paper on the rolling basis to ensure that our approach remains relevant and effective. So I think I will first stop here, and I look forward to our discussion later. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chen, for your thoughts on Taiwan's competition policy and the issue-driven approach to a non-regulated digital economy. Now to delve deeper into the digital regulation in Japan and discuss the national security aspects of such regulation, I would like to turn to Mr. Shigeru Kitamura.
Thank you very much for giving me such a precious occasion for me to express the viewpoint about the mobile ecosystem, legal system. I mentioned about three pillars on my remark. First of all, it's important understanding nature or tendency of EU's policy-making process, which differs from Japan's. First of all, Japan should realize the nature of Brussels' policy-making process differs from Japan's. The European Union is a supranational political and economic union of 27 member states. The European Commission tends to lead rulemaking on a variety of policy agenda ahead of other geos and can sometimes go extreme. To raise a simple example, the uniform requirement of USB Type-C would never happen in Japan. I interpret the efforts to regulate US big tech through the DMA as one of such cases of over-regulations. Moreover, we should understand in what context Europe has created the DMA and what sentiment has driven the European regulators. For that, we should note that in the recent European Parliament elections held June 6 to 9th, the major center-right and the center-left political groups still remained, but far-right increased their seats. The reappointment of Ursula von der Leyen as EC president was an expected outcome, but it is foreseeable that European policy making will continue to focus on protecting industries in the European single market and remain nationalistic in nature. It is said that the DMA is a part of the EU's digital sovereignty initiative. This policy trend is likely to continue or could even become intensified. It should also be noted that this results in the EU's DMA focusing more on forcing competition in digital market and helping the EU's protectionist tendencies at the expense of legitimate security data protection, and safety objectives behind how some of the digital platforms have been built. Furthermore, we should also bear in mind that national security agenda is not in the scope of the European Union's policy responsibility, but still belong to the national governments. Therefore, it is understandable that angle is not necessarily being taken into account well, since relevant stakeholders in national security space could be detached from US single market related discussions. Second point, Japan's policy-making context and consideration on geopolitical sensitivity and cybersecurity. In East Asia, particularly Japan, we should realize that we face a somewhat different sentiment and are in a different geopolitical landscape and sensitivity. In Japan, the concept of digital sovereignty hasn't necessarily prevailed in the policy-making process of DMA-like regulatory discussions. Also, given that the US is Japan's most important ally, the anti-US sentiment is not strong in general in Japan, different from that in Europe. Moreover, Japan basically doesn't take the lead in any new policy-making agenda items, but rather tends to follow the lead of other countries, especially of Europe or the US. As such, Japan's Smartphone Software Competition Promotion Act, SSCPA, was strongly encouraged by overseas regulatory developments, including the DMA's enforcement in Europe, the US DOJ's taking action, and the UK's legislative move. In Japan, it is indeed true that there were agitated discussions about whether Japanese developers were being mistreated or exploited. But at the same time, there were generally strong concerns about security risks and safety issues. In mid-June, the bill passed, but the Diet supplementary resolutions stated that security protection, privacy protection, and use protection must be ensured, and also that necessary measures should be taken in light of trends and initiatives in other countries. In this sense, the Japanese new legislation is a bit improvement on the DMA, but it remains to be seen how this will happen in practice. I don't believe that Japan's decision to follow the DMA was a good one, considering the geopolitical and cybersecurity risks that are on the rise. In the debate in the Diet, some legislators pointed out the challenges from a national security perspective, but the government's response was limited to the basic idea of coordinating with the National Security Secretariat and the National Cyber Security Center, with geopolitical risks such as the Taiwan Strait and cybersecurity risks becoming apparent, such as recent learning via US authorities that information on official telegrams from Japan's foreign ministry had been leaked to PRC. It cannot be said that truly necessary vetting process has been in place. Moreover, smartphones are now used at the forefront of security, as exemplified by the issue of the Android malware called infamous Seychelles by Five Eyes, planted by Russian military in Ukraine, and another recent case where Android malware being used in the Israeli war. Japan should definitely take these challenges into consideration when the details of the law are discussed toward enforcement. In addition, we are aware that there are discussions on sideloading in South Korea, and such discussion should fully incorporate security and cybersecurity perspective as well. I understand US-South Korea ties for national security is equally important. Third point is competition cannot happen at the cost of security. While we cannot deny the importance of competition, it should not happen at the cost of security values, including national security and cybersecurity, not to mention security for consumers. Strong mobile security, including well cybersecurity overall, is an everyday battle that requires innovation. Any regulation that not only prioritize security, but incentivize innovation in the security space will have a big impact in delivering a strong cyberspace for Japan. It is said Apple is concerned that the interoperability requirement of the DMA may compromise the integrity of the Apple products in ways that risk user privacy and data security. Thus, recently, Apple decided not to roll out Apple Intelligence for the time being in Europe, despite having been built with user safety and privacy in mind, two areas of concern in the generative AI space. Their claim is to some extent understandable. It will be disadvantageous to general consumers and businesses if something similar may happen in Japan. The regulator should want to avoid that. In Europe, investigation and preliminary findings in relation to the DMA have begun coming out, and they seem to be challenging to digital platforms. However, it is essential to assess the side effect of any extreme direction taken by the European Union. In European Union case, if side effects are recognized, the rules themselves might be reviewed through it will take time, and the effectiveness of the discipline will be challenged, including in court. On the other hand, in case of Japan, once a rule is established, there is a tendency to continue to follow it to the last detail, and it is difficult to make modifications of a challenge. This time, cybersecurity is explicitly stipulated in the Smartphone Software Competition Promotion Act, SSCPA, as an exemption, and it is necessary to steer the process so that it becomes a workable one. Thank you very much for your listening.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kitamura, for those insightful remarks on the state of affairs in Japan and for highlighting the potential impacts on digital regulation on both competitiveness and national security. Now, I would like to ask Dr. Shin to discuss the situation in Korea and offer his perspective on digital regulation. Dr. Shin, please go ahead.
Okay, could we go to the next page? So I'm going to talk a little bit about the status of DMA regulation and legislations in South Korea, and also what KFTC is planning to do, as well as concluding with my remarks and recommendations. So if you look at the first slide, last year and the beginning of this year, during the 21st National Assembly, there were a number of various platform bills were introduced. However, most of them, none of them passed because due to fierce opposition. So if you look at the purpose of these bills, they're generally to enhance contestability of the market and to regulate the abuse of any kind of superior bargaining power, which is not an antitrust issue, but is also a very big part of KFTC regulation and enforcement. And three, protecting users or consumers of these platforms. in the new National Assembly, 22nd National Assembly, just recently, 5 new laws were introduced. They were basically same as the ones that were introduced, just a subset of the ones that were introduced earlier. And so I will talk a little bit more about these later, but I just want to say that the fierce opposition came as the main points are that there are harm to innovation due to these types of regulation. Korea did not do a market study that really needed to be done to understand what kind of regulation are needed in Korea. And then there are champions in Korea. Now, unlike Europe, unlike other countries, Korean companies have dominance in some of the areas, and that these types of regulation will kill off the Korean champions. And then there were concerns about the relationship with the United States. Can we get to the next page? So let me just talk a little bit about the new law. The new law, all these laws talk about basically 2 main points. One is that there's a pre-designation system, just like the DMA. You have a gatekeeper, and so you say, oh, these are the ones who are going to be under regulation. And then 2, there's do's and don'ts, just like the DMAs. But then depending on the legislation or the proposal, the do's and don'ts differ. So if you are looking at this, usually the don'ts are preventing self-preferencing, preventing tying, most favored nation clauses, etc. Okay. The assemblyman who introduced says that they have gathered all the public opinions and have come up with, this great proposal. But I am not sure if that's the case, because I think it's going to be faced with a lot of fierce opposition from the public. Now, the KFTC, on the other hand, is more cautious. They have been gathering stakeholders' opinions through various seminars and panel discussions. I have participated in some of them. They are referencing other countries' DMA regulations, particularly the European ones. They have not finished drafting the bill, at least they claim, but plan to release a version in the near future. Next slide. So previously they announced that last year, December of last year, a proposal, but obviously did not pass due to fierce opposition of the various stakeholders. But the new feature of the next KFT proposal is a little bit more cautious. The KFT's director in charge of drafting the new law recently remarked that new law is necessary, but it will focus on don'ts and not do's. And he claims that this is not a ex ante regulation, but it will be closer to more ex post regulation. What I think will happen is that KFTC is trying to shift the burden of proof to the stakeholders or the gatekeepers so that they could go ahead with the enforcement in a much without any delays. Because obviously, if you have to go through the court to prove that they have dominance and other things, then it's going to be very difficult. So finally, the KFTC is conducting a market study after a long delay. So we'll see what happens after that comes out. Next page. But unfortunately, or fortunately, the expected KFTC proposal will have many obstacles. First, the National Assembly is in shambles in Korea right now. The opposition party and ruling party are fighting, and a lot of the bills are being passed without the ruling party's approval, and it's being vetoed by the president. And so I think this will continue on until the political infighting. This will continue on as long as the political infighting continues. And the other thing is that the ruling party, as President Yoon suggested, that regulation during his presidency election is the best option, whereas the opposition party wants to have more say on the regulation, and that they want to have more stricter regulatory rules. So if you think about what I said about the KFTC proposal, they are kind of running the middle ground. And so it's not satisfying anyone. And therefore, I think it's going to be very difficult for them to pass the National Assembly. They will need a bipartisan support if they wanted to pass that. And like I said, this will not happen until there's a political compromise at the National Assembly level. Next page. So I just want to make a couple of observations and recommendations. First, my main point is that it is wise to delay enacting DMA type regulation in Korea. And the reasons are, one, I am an economist who studied regulation for a long time, almost 40 years of experience. And regulation comes with a very high cost and a lot of mistakes. And so my point is we should learn from European experience that Europe has already passed a law, it's being enforced. And so why jump on the bandwagon from the start when we can learn from their experience to see what really happens? Does innovation matter? Does innovation deteriorate? What kind of impact does it have on the market? Those are the kinds of things that we could examine and understand before making the final regulation in Korea. As I mentioned before, the regulatory costs can be substantial for ex-ante regulation. If you think about the United States, you have the FCC, that's regulating telephone industry, telecommunications industry, and DOJ and FTC doing an ex post enforcement. But as I said before, the ex-ante regulation is very, very costly, and I've known that from my past experience. I just want to mention that a CSIS study, this is a US think tank, estimates that such costs for DMAs and DSAs in Europe to be between $22 billion to $50 billion to the US firms. Now, this could be overstated, but this is 8% to 70% of the European revenues for these high-tech companies in the United States. So there is a high concern, a very high concern about the cost of these types of regulatory regulation on US firms. So if I give experience from my background, AT&T was broken up in 1984, and right after the breakup, AT&T basically reduced their workforce by 1/3 without having any impact on the service of AT&T. So that a lot of people have attributed to the cost of regulation. So anyways, next page. The other concern with DMAs is that the European style imposes a lot of obligations on the gatekeepers, but does not provide any appropriate compensation for these companies. We have to keep in mind that these companies became big and powerful as a result of fiercely competing in these markets. And they have spent a lot of investment to gain members, to gain their networks, to use their network. But if you force them to, if you obligated them to share this network with others, there should be some reasonable compensation for sharing with that, with the competitors. So this is just coming from my telecom background and experience, that the networks, when they compete, but when they do cooperate, or they need to be compensated for their investments. So DMA wants to promote competition by reducing consumer switching costs and allowing multi-homing and data mobility. These are all great ideas, but again, there are a lot of legal and economic reasons why some of these ideas may not work. Not all prohibited behaviors are always anti-competitive. Next slide. And we already know from the European experience that some of these privacy laws are used to exclude exchange of information with competitors. And so we need to figure out what types of regulation will actually work and what types of regulation will actually be abusive. So in the final remark, what I want to say is that there is without the DMA type legislation in the United States and in Korea, there has been fierce and very strong enforcement of antitrust laws. And I think for the time being, we should let the ex post regulation work its course and wait for the European experience to filter through to find out what would be the best option for Korea. Thank you.
Dr. Shin, thank you for your analysis of the situation in Korea and the economic effects of ex-ante digital regulation. Now let's hear from Mr. Coniglio about the American perspective on digital regulation, as well as his thought on digital regulations in Asia and around the world.
Thank you, Leila, and also my thanks to the other panelists for joining us here at ITIF. We're very honored to have such a distinguished group, as well as thank you to everybody tuning in. I want to focus my remarks, which I'm going to try and keep brief so we can get to our discussion, on what I think are the two core problems that policymakers need to deal with when thinking about regulation, which really get at the fundamental incentives and ability for regulators to improve the markets in which they're dealing. And then I want to sort of delve into those issues as to how they're likely to materialize for digital regulation, specifically in East Asia. And I want to touch on some of the lessons I think we can learn from history about regulation in the United States, as well as some of the early signs that are already coming out of Europe with the DMA, both of which I think are highly instructive for East Asian policymakers. So first, there's a problem of regulators just frankly not having the knowledge they need ex ante to determine what market outcomes are going to be optimal and optimal. And the idea here is that economic knowledge can be dispersed throughout the market and is often discovered through the process of competition itself, whereby competition in markets are the way that you figure out what the right market outcomes are, as opposed to something that regulators can figure out a priori. And empirically, the history of regulation in the United States, I think, is very, very clear how these sorts of limitations can lead to problems with regulation, and how I think generally deregulation in the United States, while it obviously the effects will vary by industry, but as a general matter, spurred innovation and economic growth that the United States has seen in the past 40 years. Second, there's another problem about regulators not having the incentives always to act in the public interest, which you sometimes hear called regulatory capture, and which you see discussed in some economic literature in the United States, but elsewhere. And the idea here is that even, let's say, an industry where regulators do have the knowledge to figure out how they can improve markets, they often end up being incentivized for one reason or another to benefit certain firms rather than others, and ultimately pick winners and losers that can have the effect of actually entrenching the market power of incumbents at the expense of the entrants who are going to deliver the real competition that's going to improve the market. And again, even the U.S., where we've long prided ourselves on the rule of law and fairness, we've seen this sort of problem. I would give the example of cable regulation, as well as the Robinson-Patman Act, frankly, of schemes that really harmed consumers and innovation, and ultimately just benefited certain parties. Now, turning to East Asia specifically and digital regulation, I think you can see these problems manifest themselves in at least three ways. So first, at the outset, one sense in which this is relevant concerns digital regulation and who it's going to apply to. So on the one hand, you have regimes like Japan's smartphone bill discussed by Mr. Kitamura, which is really very narrowly tailored to a few companies in a specific industry. And on the one hand, you might think, well, this is narrowly tailored. That might help solve some of the problems with needing broad economic knowledge to do regulation right. But on the other hand, such narrow tailoring can have can exacerbate concerns about regulatory capture and discriminating against firms, for example, just because they're big American firms. And by contrast, with the Korean proposal, as Dr. Shin described, you do see, in a way, at least a broader bill that tries to cover firms that are not just American. It's a bit broader, at least in theory. But for that reason, raises concerns on the other side about chilling Korean innovation and stifling its digital markets. So second, turning to the substance of digital regulation, the knowledge problems, if I describe them, are really exacerbated when you're talking about dynamic digital markets that I think display much of the Schumpeterian competition that we heard, I think, Dr. Chen really discuss, although not mentioning Schumpeter by name, platform competition, competition for the market, where innovation really is the key mode of competition. And it's really, really hard for regulators to do things like, let's say, benefit what could be short-run harms to static competition against long-run benefits to dynamic and innovation competition that really drive economic growth. And I think we're already starting to see this, frankly, play out in a couple ways with the DMA in Europe and how we're really seeing harm to consumers. And one example I would give is self-preferencing restrictions on firms like Google, where I think it's, the evidence is already very clear that the DMA is creating a much worse user interface that is making consumers, for example, have to make many more clicks to get the answers they want relative to what prevailed before. And finally, with respect to the regulatory capture issue or the incentives issue, again, I think this is particularly problematic when you're talking about digital regulation. And again, thinking from a Schumpeterian perspective, where you really do see competition for the market and winners with very high rents that they can get if they win the digital platform Schumpeterian competition. And again, here with Europe and the DMA, I think we're already seeing signs of this problem being made manifest about picking winners and losers rather than actually helping the public interest. So, I mean, to keep running with the Google example and self-preferencing, a lot of what we're seeing coming from the DMA is about sending traffic away from Google to its rivals, intermediaries like Booking and TripAdvisor, and also away from hotels and restaurants, small businesses, the sort of people that you would want a regulation to help in theory. So let me just stop there now, and hopefully we can get into some discussion on these issues.
Thank you, Joseph, for all of that helpful context. Now I would like to continue with questions and group discussion, and I would like to encourage our audience to submit their questions via Slido. First, given the unique market dynamics of East Asia, with a mix of established domestic players and powerful global platforms, do you believe that East Asian countries need their own digital regulations similar to the EU's DMA? Dr. Chin, would you like to begin?
Okay, thanks for the question. As of now, there's no ex-ante regulation specific to digital platform has been enacted by the Congress in Taiwan. There was recently a failed attempt by the National Communication Commission, NCC, which is responsible for regulating telecommunication industry. They are trying to enact Digital Intermediary Service Act, which is similar to the Digital Service Act in EU. But the attempt was failed. The attempt failed because due to the disagreement regarding the breadth and the uncertainty of regulation and its impacts on the freedom of expression. So I think the answer to your question regarding whether East Asia needs a DMA regulation, the answer could be yes or no. And it all depends on the result of the reviewing of the following two factors. The first one is that, is there a new theory of harm that cannot be addressed by the conventional analytical framework in competition law? And the second factor need to be taken into account is, if the answer to the first question is yes, then what kind of approach should be undertaken by the government? Is it the revised or optimized rule of reason for individual cases review, of course, including the benefits from innovation? Or is this really necessary for the government to adopt ex-ante regulation that stimulates the do's and don'ts for digital platform beforehand? I think both approaches are likely to be followed by any jurisdiction, but of course, there are limits for both approach. With the former approach, which is the ex-post approach, is that the approach fails to control the market power expansion at its incipiency. And once the market is tipped toward dominance, and reversing that trend becomes very challenging or unlikely. And the limit to the ex-ante regulation is that it needs sufficient regulatory information to avoid over-deterrence and the under-deterrence problem. And of course, there are other regulatory costs, as was mentioned by Mr. Shin in his preparation, and using Korea as an example. Probably there is a capture problem. Probably there is a rent-seeking problem. I think that's the problem common to all kinds of ex-ante regulation. So no matter what approach to follow, I think the decision should be made on the cost and benefits to a jurisdiction by adopting one of the approaches. And along the way, to decide which approach to follow, we should be particularly mindful that the adoption of ex-ante regulation should not be spurred primarily by catching the coattail of other jurisdictions. And due to globalization and the fact that almost all digital giants are operating multinationally, it has a ring of truth that no jurisdiction could single-handedly tackle the competitive problems emerging from the digital platform. Nevertheless, the observation was rested on the assumption that the types of competitive concerns are uniform, and that the magnitude of competitive harm is consistent across all jurisdictions. So let me put it differently. It is undeniable that the digital technology is advancing very, very quickly, but the types and the seriousness of the competitive problem it concomitantly generate could still be rather distinctive in different jurisdictions. So if the country of the state fail to consider the differences across the jurisdiction, legal harmonization might inadvertently generate what economists like to call externality, in the sense that the part of the enforcement cost from a jurisdiction are actually borne by other jurisdictions. So I think personally, the following factors may be useful in assisting an agency and the legislator to conduct cost-benefit analysis of the regulatory mode that they should pursue. I think that on the micro level, probably we should consider the market structure of the relevant market, or the degree of market contestability, and the degree and the prevalence of digital ecosystem competition, and also the degree of innovation competition, as was touched upon by Mr. Konya, and also the consumer's preferences for digital platform. And on a more macro level, I think it's worthwhile for a government or policymaker to consider the scale of digital economy vis-a-vis a non-digital economy in the countries. Because the more important the digital economy is for a country, then there is more necessary, no necessity, it is probably likely to be more necessary for the country to take into account the digital market, the need of regulating the digital market. And also on the macro level, I think the penetration rate of the digital technology in the country should also be taken into account. There's a demand side observation of the macro effect from the digital regulation. And consistency, from the supply side, the maturity and sophistication of digital technology also is important for our assessment of which approach to follow in terms of the digital market regulation. And finally, I think we should also consider the consistency and the conflicts with existing or potential industrial policies. I think this is probably more prominent in the Asian region, because as far as I know, there are many industry policy in the Asian regions aiming specifically to foster the growth of a specific digital industry, especially, for example, the platform industry, or even in the future, the AI industry. So it is quite foreseeable that the conflicts between the competition policy and in the future, the industry policy might be getting more and more prominent in the future. And I think that is also a factor that need to be taken into account. So since Taiwan right now has no, unlike Japan and Korea, there is no ex ante regulation on the table for both the Congress or for the agency. So I think what I have offered is a sort of that more theoretical analysis or discussion based on our enforcement experience. I think I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Chen. Would anyone else would like to weigh in?
Leila, let me just offer some brief thoughts here. So first, I want to echo what Dr. Shin said about regulation being needed to be tailored to market failure. And on this score, I would suggest that much like, Taiwan, who has decided not to go forward with digital regulation, I don't think market failure appears to exist in the digital markets of Korea or Japan, obviously, both of which are very high-tech economies that have dynamic and growing digital markets. So, I mean, just a few points. First, with respect to Korea, there are several dynamic digital companies that are competing: Coupang, Gmarket, Kakao, Naver, and others that are growing and competing not just in Korea but also throughout Asia, whose growth is, as I say, likely to be stifled by digital regulation. And with Japan, briefly, on the smartphone industry, I think it's important to remember here, but also generally, that market failure is more than just having, a few firms that may benefit from network effects, right? That's not sufficient to show market failure. You have to look at actual market outcomes like prices, output, and innovation. And, actually, I would note in reports that were issued by the JFTC and also the Secretariat of the Headquarters for Digital Market and Competition, it was acknowledged huge smartphone growth in Japan. For example, one data point from 2010 to 2021, an increase in the penetration rate from 10% to 90%. So I think that's really strong evidence that we're looking at an industry that's growing and not one indicative of market failure.
Well, from my perspective, I made it clear in my presentation that, East Asian countries should probably wait and learn from the European experience. And I agree with Dr. Chen that, each country has their own priorities and needs, and that may not be solved by passing a TMA-like law. So I think my vote is for, let's wait, let's learn from the European experience. And like Joe said, we really should look for where the market failure is, what are some of the egregious problems, and try to fine-tune our legislation to fix those types of problems.
Thank you very much for your contribution. I would like to bring in another question. What are the potential implications of digital regulation on national security, and in particular in the context of platform security, for example, on smartphones, disinformation, and also on the broader US-China rivalry? Mr. Kitamura, would you like to start?
First of all, as I mentioned, from time to time, the legal advisor on the competition policy is rather indifferent to the security issues. But the most important thing concerning the process of the enactment of the Smartphone Software Competition Promotion Act. But anyhow, during this process, I underscore the importance of the security and the protection of the privacy and the protection of youth. Actually, the government is preparing for the decree, the instruction concerning this legal system. I like to express my viewpoint about this process. Anyhow, in considering actual security situation of the East Asia, it's very severe. From time to time, for example, I cite the example of the Ukraine warfare. Modern warfare is always starting by the cyber attack. It's the same story in the crisis of the Taiwan Strait. Therefore, I underscore the security of the mobile phone. At the same time, concerning the market system, actually, the some standard of the quality is guaranteed by the platformer, but the too much competition policy introduction over this system, it will disrupt actual equivalence of the market. Some researcher is very anxious about give birth to the lemon market. Lemon is the not no good used car market because the consumer doesn't know the quality. At the same time, the supplier itself believe make effort to maintain the standards of these articles. I think the over intervention of the government from the viewpoint of the competition policy give rise to such kind of situation, even to the application market in the mobile ecosystem. Thank you very much.
I think I can add a little bit about this question. The fraud and misinformation problem is currently I think it is on the top of the drawer of the government's policy, because we recently have just passed 4 laws aiming to address the problem of misinformation or disinformation on the disseminating through a digital platform. And the problem of disinformation and national security might be intertwined, especially for Taiwan, because if you know the political tension between Taiwan and China, we are especially concerned about the information disseminated from China and which was circulated on the internet. But at this moment, for all the laws that has been passed to regulate the information problem on the digital platform, none of them has anything to do with competition issue. Actually, they are sort of the spatial legislation. And in terms of competition law in Taiwan, we do have the authority over what we call the false advertisement. Supposedly, misinformation is a false claim of the products or service. And then the TFTC might intervene a little bit. And one of the emanating issue from the information problem is the privacy protections. And again, the TFTC treated privacy protection in digital platform as a perimeter for competition. By saying that, it means that we will treat the provision of privacy protection as a competing perimeter for companies. So if a consumer really need the privacy protection, then there's no reason for company or digital platform to offer or compete to provide the better protection of privacy to the final user. So I just want to say that those national security and the misinformation problem are very important problem, but in Taiwan it was they are addressed by other legislation, but the TFTC has only limited jurisdiction over these issues. Thank you.
Concerning the disinformation issue, I think the responsibility of the platformer is rather big. But what is important is for the disinformation. I think 2 pillars are so important. One is fact-checking, and the second one is the literacy. On the process of the fact-checking, I propose to the Japanese government to create a new entity composed of the platformer and the journalism and the researcher to detect the disinformation in the vast, the sphere of the internet. Thank you very much.
Would anyone else like to weigh in here?
I'll just make some very brief remarks, if I may, Leila. I see we're near the end of the hour, and thanks to our panelists for staying on a little bit longer. So first, I want to address the U.S.-China rivalry point that Leila raised, which I think is going to define really so much of the 21st century. And on the U.S. perspective, I think that digital regulation is very unlikely in that context in the United States, as it's really not in the United States' interest to deviate from the model that has really been very effective at giving it the digital and technological edge that it enjoys, especially at a time when I think technological leadership in the West and among its allies is more important than ever, given China's rise. And second, I would echo what I think others have said. From an American perspective, there's no doubt that digital regulation in Korea, Japan, or any jurisdiction that's imposing heavy costs on American firms is invariably going to create some tensions in the United States relationship with those countries. And in addition to that, you have, of course, the harms to innovation that have been discussed. So when you take all that together, ultimately, I think the primary beneficiary of these regulations isn't going to be America. It's not even going to be Japan, Korean, or any East Asian countries' digital markets. It's going to be China, who's going to benefit from the unforced error to our own innovation and the tensions that are created in the relationships as a result. So thank you.
Would anyone else like to join the conversation?
Well, I just want to mention that the Chinese companies, Temu and Alibaba, is trying to penetrate Korean online market by offering low quality, low price products. And their penetration rate has increased tremendously. But on the other hand, it's reaching, I think, some kind of plateau because Korean consumers are savvy enough to understand that the reason why they're offering these types of low prices is to gain information, and there has been some abuses of that. And then they're also savvy about type of low quality products that are being sold online and the risks associated with that. And so I think these types of regulations ties the hands of the existing players, and at the same time allowing some of these Chinese firms to enter the market in a very accelerated manner, and that raises a concern. And I think this competition issue and the security issue is a slightly different issue, I think, and that we need to approach it on a separate point-by-point basis. I don't think we need to tie all of them together into one law or one action. So, and I agree with Joe's point about this fight that's going on. And the question is, U.S. tech companies won, and there's a reason why the U.S. companies won. And the question is, we really need to understand what prompted that, what prompted the innovation in the United States that did not happen in other countries. The Korean champions survived because there are certain cultural differences, and they were able to take advantage of these kinds of differences. It happened in Japan too. I think Japan, the top 4 U.S. tech companies are not the most dominant companies in all aspects, just like in Korea. But the question is, the U.S. companies are dominant in many cases, and why is that? There is a reason why that happened, and so we need to really look into that. Thank you.
Thank you to all of our esteemed panelists for providing us with a nuanced understanding of the challenges and opportunities presented by such ex-ante digital regulations in East Asia. I would like to briefly summarize the key takeaways of our panel. The European Union's DMA, while groundbreaking, needs to be viewed in the light of East Asia's distinct market dynamics. As Dr. Chen highlighted, some countries in the region might benefit from a less regulated approach. Mr. Kitamura's emphasis on the broader implications of national digital regulations underscores the need for careful consideration of national security, competitiveness, and related geopolitical issues. Dr. Shin's insights on the complexities and harms associated with ex-ante regulations highlight the importance of ensuring that digital regulation does not end up harming consumers and innovation. Mr. Coniglio's perspective adds that studying the US history with regulation as well as the role of the DMA can provide valuable lessons for East Asia amidst increasingly challenging technological environment. I would like to thank you again to all of our esteemed panelists for their insightful contributions, and thank our audience for their engagement. Finally, I encourage the audience to stay tuned for the ITIF's upcoming events.